Hi everybody, in this video we're going to be talking about providing consequences and specifically when a kid engages in a behavior, providing some type of positive consequence, so reinforcement. Here are our objectives on the left, and then for our agenda we are going to first go over just some things about feedback. Then we're going to talk about reinforcement, and then the difference between positive and negative reinforcement. Then we're going to talk about some factors that affect reinforcement, and then end it with a little discussion on reinforcement in the classroom. So, is feedback important? And the answer to that is yes, feedback is hugely important. We see that with feedback, it increases student engagement, it increases student achievement, which is really key for our kids with EBD because remember, they are really low in engagement and they are low in their academic skills and also low in their social skills as well. So you guys providing feedback as a teacher is just really important for our kids with EBD. And what we typically find is that teachers don't effectively use feedback. And there are even some schools where they say that feedback is bad, so they urge their teachers not to use feedback and not to use reinforcement. And there are some websites in your module that explain the reasons behind that, but one of the big ones is that providing other kids with reinforcement or praise and things like that essentially hurts other kids' self-esteem. So the kids that aren't getting the praise, it hurts their self-esteem and it actually does more harm than good. But we have tons of research showing that reinforcement and feedback in general is hugely important, and it's not the case that it's actually negative or hurtful to other kids. And also what we show is that students with EBD and with those really big challenging behaviors receive even less praise than our typically developing gen ed kids. So not only do our kids with EBD not only do kids in general not get enough praise and enough feedback, but our kids with EBD get even less praise and feedback. And so, like I said earlier, we have tons of research that says that providing reinforcement increases engagement and increases achievement, which is what we want, especially in our kids with EBD. All right, I mentioned this in the last module, but I want to bring it back because I do think it's really important. This is a system called the Basic 5 Behavior Benchmarks, and you guys can go online, you can Google this, and get these kind of data sheets that are right over here. But what we're looking at with this one, specifically in this module, are the ratio of interactions. So this is a ratio of positive to negative interactions, which, and if you guys remember this from last module, whenever you guys measure these, if you are less than 1 to 1 or less than 1 interaction per minute, then you're in this dark column and you need to do something different. If you're at least 1 to 1 consistently, then you're in this medium column and you just want to be cautious. So they do recommend an intervention here, but it's not immediate. And then if you're in the light column, then you're doing great and keep doing what you're doing. And so these Basic 5 behavior benchmarks gives you a way to actually measure these behaviors and objectively determine your ratio of interactions. So with this form 5.6, if you guys go online and Google it, you're going to do a 20-minute recording time. It's going to be any activity, and you can use it for individual or class-wide monitoring. So you can take that 5.6 data sheet and you can, and here, I have another one in the next slide, but you just take a 20-minute activity and you can either do it for an individual kid with EBD or you can do it class-wide, just in general. And this is kind of what it looks like. So I know this is 5.2, but the step 1, and this is a 10-minute period instead of a 20, so some of these forms are a little different. But basically during a 10-minute period for this one, you're going to tally your ratio of interactions, so how many positive you had and how many negative, and then you can look at that within the ratio. And so really you want to be 3 to 1 consistently, and you can see with this teacher she's 7 to 2 over 10 minutes, and if you reduce that down it's 3 to 1, so she's right on key, she's where she's supposed to be. And in your module I have an article for you guys to read, which is actually really interesting. So it talks about how, typical kids are fine with 3 to 1, 4 to 1, and even 5 to 1 ratio of interactions. And so I do want to make this clear. This is 3, 4, 5 positive to 1 negative, whereas our kids with EBD need a lot more positive than negative. So they need about a 9 to 1 ratio. So 9 positive to 1 negative. All right, so let's get into reinforcement. And first I wanted to start with a super technical definition. So this is a hard technical definition of reinforcement. So I have it here on the slide, and then I'm going to go through and explain it. So reinforcement is the process, which means it's not the reinforcing stimulus or the act of reinforcing. It's this whole process by which you have a behavior and then a consequence, and the behavior increases in the future. So that whole process is reinforcement. And then, so the process by which a stimulus change, and the stimulus change is actually the consequence. So this is the presentation or removal of a stimulus. Does something get given or taken away? And that is the consequence, and that's what we mean by the stimulus change. So the process by which a stimulus change that is contingent on, so this is a contingency, which means that consequence or that stimulus change reliably follows the response. It doesn't come before the response, it follows the response, and it rarely occurs at other times. So basically, the stimulus change is dependent on the response, or is more likely to occur when this response has just occurred. So it's this if-then relationship. If the behavior occurs, then this happens, and that consequence doesn't happen at other times, only when the behavior occurs. So the process by which a stimulus change that is contingent on a response, and remember, we reinforce behaviors or responses, not persons. So you don't want to say that you provided little Johnny with praise. You actually gave little Johnny's hand-raising praise or something like that. So you reinforce a response or a behavior. And then the whole point of reinforcement is that the response is going to increase in the future. So it increases the future probability of the response. So the consequences affect the probability of similar behavior occurring again in the future. So to put this together, we have the process. So reinforcement is a process by which a stimulus change or that consequence is contingent on a response, which increases the future probability of that response. And I also wanted to go back to this increases the future probability. If the behavior doesn't increase, then it's not reinforcement. So for it to be reinforcement, it has to increase in the future or continue to occur or to be maintained. If it's not the case, if it's decreasing or you don't know if it's going to increase in the future, then it's not reinforcement. Okay, so let's look at 2 examples and try to see if they're reinforcement or not. So first one, we have little Nathan. And Nathan finishes all of his vegetables at dinner one night, and his parents give him ice cream for dessert. The next night, Nathan does not finish all of his vegetables. So first thing we want to kind of do is pick out the behavior. And in this example, the behavior is finishing his vegetables. And then we want to look at, does that behavior increase in the future? And so the next night, Nathan does not finish all of his vegetables. So the behavior is not increasing in the future. So this is not going to be an example of reinforcement. Let's look at our next example. Every time Nathan tells his mom that she looks good today, his mom gives him smiles, hugs, and kisses. As a result, Nathan becomes more likely to tell his mom that she looks good. So let's pick out the behavior, which is telling his mom that she looks good, and Nathan becomes more likely to tell his mom that she looks good. So the behavior is increasing, and therefore this would be an example of reinforcement. So pick out the behavior. The behavior increases in the future, reinforcement. If not, it's not reinforcement. Okay, so let's look at the difference between positive and negative reinforcement. So with positive reinforcement, you have a response that occurs, a stimulus is presented, and the future probability of the response increases. We get this positive because something is given or something is presented or something is added. You might see it signified in different ways. And then I like Homer over here. He kind of says, woohoo! So typically we refer to this as a pleasant stimulus. This is the reinforcer. And it's pleasant because it increases the response in the future, or it increases the future probability of the response. We are always looking at our effects on behavior. So if our behavior increases, it's going to be reinforcement. And this stimulus or this reinforcer, we know it's a reinforcer or what we call a pleasant stimulus because the response increases. Negative reinforcement, something aversive is in effect. A response occurs and the aversive stimulus is removed, and therefore the future probability of the response increases. And so you can see Homer over here. He's like, whoo. So, a simple example of this is you have a headache. Your response is you take aspirin. Aspirin removes your headache, and therefore in the future, when you start to have a headache, you take aspirin and your headache gets removed. So that's a kind of a really common example of negative reinforcement. Remember, so with negative, we say it's negative because something is taken away or removed, but it's still reinforcement right here. So your response is going to increase because that aversive stimulus was removed. Remember, always about the effects on behavior. So this just shows you guys with both positive and negative reinforcement, you have a response that occurs. And then the difference is right here, whether something gets added or given or something gets removed or taken away. And remember, both of these, both positive and negative, both reinforcement, so they both increase future probability of the response. Okay, so 3 steps to remember, and we're going to add a step in there. So when we looked at those reinforcement examples, we identified the behavior and looked at whether it was increasing. This time, to tell if something is positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, we're still going to identify the behavior, but now we're going to look at the consequence. After the behavior occurred, was something given or taken away? If something was given, it's going to be positive. If something was taken away, it's going to be negative. And then we're going to look at, did the behavior increase? If it increased, then yes, it's reinforcement. If it didn't, it's not reinforcement. So for example 1, we have a child starts screaming in a boring store. The parent offers to go for ice cream as soon as they're done. Next time they go to the store, the child screams again, and the parent offers ice cream. So first let's look at, first let's look at the behavior. Our behavior is the child screaming. So the child's behavior is screaming. Then we are going to look at, is something being given or taken away? And we say yes, the parent is offering to go for ice cream, so something is being given. That makes it positive. And then we're going to look at, is the behavior increasing or decreasing? And it says that the child screams again, so we know that the behavior is increasing, so this is reinforcement. So this would be an example of a positive reinforcement contingency. All right, example 2. Same exact example, except we're going to look at it from the parent's perspective. So from the parent's perspective, what is a parent's behavior? And the parent's behavior is offering to go for ice cream. Okay, so next is after the parents offer to go for ice cream, is something being given or taken away? And we see that the child stops screaming, so something's being taken away. So this part of taken away would be negative. And then last is the parent's behavior increasing or decreasing? And we see that the parent offers ice cream again next time they go to the store. So parent's behavior is increasing. So from the parent's perspective, this is going to be negative reinforcement. And example 1, example 2, they typically happen a lot. I've seen it in grocery stores and everything like that. And it kind of becomes a slippery slope downhill because the child screams, they get their ice cream, so they scream again in the future, and then the parent offering ice cream makes the child be quiet because everybody's looking at them, and it just, all in all, is a cycle that reinforces lots of inappropriate behavior. Okay, here's some other examples, and we're going to go through these one by one. So pick out your behavior, see if something's afterwards, if something is given or taken away, and then does the behavior increase. So for example 1, let's pick out our behavior. It is walking in the hall, and after that, his teacher gives him a hug. So something gets given, so it's positive. And then in the future, James walks in the hall more often. So the behavior is increasing. So this would be our positive right here, reinforcement right here. Okay, example 2. When the teacher sees her students working, she reduces the number of homework problems. In the future, the students work more. So students working is the behavior. And after the behavior occurs, the teacher reduces the number of homework problems. So something gets taken away. And in the future, the students work more. So something gets taken away, which is negative, and students work more, the behavior is increasing, so that's the reinforcement part. So this is negative right here, reinforcement right here. Number 3, when Bertrand gets 100% on all math problems, his teacher gives him $5 in Monopoly money. In the future, he gets 100% at the same rate as before. So behavior is getting 100% on all math problems. After it occurs, his teacher gives him $5 in Monopoly money. And then in the future, it occurs at the same rate. So we can see that his behavior is not increasing in the future. So this is actually not an example of reinforcement. And lastly, you have a fear that your partner is cheating on you, so you decide to check their phone. You do this and are reassured that your partner isn't cheating. The next day, you repeat the behavior and feel better again. So behavior is you check your partner's phone and you are reassured that your partner isn't cheating. And then the next day, you repeat the behavior. So behavior, checking your phone. After it, you want to look at, does something get taken or given away? And your anxiety that your fear that your partner is cheating gets taken away. And then you want to look at, is the behavior increasing? And you repeat it the next day. So this would be negative because your anxiety goes away when you engage in the behavior, and you're repeating the behavior, so it's the reinforcement. So this is an example of negative reinforcement. Not a very healthy example, but an example nonetheless. So in all of these, pick out your behavior, figure out if after the behavior occurs, does something get taken or given, and then look at the effects on behavior. If the behavior is increasing, then it's reinforcement. And I also wanted to kind of make a side note. This reinforcer, or whatever the teacher gives him, it doesn't matter if it's good or bad. Remember, we're always looking at the effects on the behavior. So it doesn't matter, your opinion on the stimulus that is given doesn't matter at all. It matters, we refer to it as a pleasant stimulus or a reinforcer if it increases the future probability of the behavior or if it strengthens the behavior. Like I said, always looking at the effects on behavior. So sometimes people have not crazy, but really unique things that function as reinforcers for them, and you might have a negative viewpoint about that item, but it doesn't matter. Your opinion about that item doesn't matter. We would still refer to it as a pleasant stimulus or a reinforcer if it increases the future probability of that person's behavior. Okay, a little side note on negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is not is not punishment. Punishment decreases behavior. Remember, negative reinforcement is going to increase a behavior. It does not necessarily produce negative behaviors, and then it does not necessarily involve pain. So just because it says negative doesn't mean that it involves pain. Negative means that there's some aversive stimulus that you found uncomfortable. It could be a threat, it could be anxiety, something like that, that is removed after the behavior occurs. Okay, some factors that influence reinforcement. The first one is immediacy. So when you have a reinforcer, you want to deliver it immediately after the behavior occurs, as close to the behavior occurring as possible. The reason for that is if the person engages in the behavior and you wait 15 seconds or 30 seconds to deliver the reinforcer, there's a chance that they're already engaging in another behavior and they might not really understand why you're reinforcing them. They don't understand that you're reinforcing them for a behavior that happened 15 seconds or 30 seconds ago. So that immediacy, them engaging the behavior and you providing the reinforcer as quickly as possible lets it be really clear what behavior you're reinforcing. And then if you don't reinforce it immediately, we just know from the research that immediate reinforcement works way better than delayed reinforcement. And you guys can think of when you make a New Year's resolution to go work out, for example. Lots of people make those New Year's resolutions to work out, and within a couple of weeks, they're not working out anymore. So they're really gung-ho at the beginning, and then they kind of stop working out. And that's because your reinforcer for working out is very, very, very delayed. So you have to work out at least 3 months or at least 6 months consistently to actually lose weight and to see some muscle toning up and to gain muscle and things like that. And that's a huge delayed reinforcer. And so a lot of times it's not strong enough to actually strengthen that behavior of working out. It's not strong enough and it's just so delayed that it's not really effective. So immediate reinforcement is way more effective and much better. Then you have to look at the contingency. So making sure you have that if-then relationship. When the kid engages in this behavior, they get this consequence, they get this reinforcer. Then you want to look at the wants of your students. So what are you using as a reinforcer? Do your students want that reinforcer? That's huge. If they don't want the thing that you're reinforcing them with, then they're not going to work for it because it doesn't matter if they get it or not. And you can think of praise. If a student doesn't care if you praise them or not, then praise isn't going to be effective as a reinforcer. And so you might have to go look for something else, maybe a tangible item or an edible or something like that. Well, an edible is a tangible item, but something like that in addition to your praise. So really look at what you're reinforcing the students with and make sure that they want that item and they will work for it. And then along those lines, you want to look at their individual differences. So something that is reinforcing for one person may not be reinforcing for another person. One student might really, really work for good grades, and one student might not care at all about good grades. So, knowing what your students want and realizing that there are individual differences within students is hugely important. And then the magnitude. So make sure that we have something that we call a ratio strain. So make sure that the amount of work they're doing equals the amount of reinforcement that you give them. If you have them doing 100 math problems and they get a little bit of the reinforcer, then you're going to have what we call a ratio strain, and they're going to work way harder and not get enough reinforcement for it, and they're probably not going to be motivated to do that in the future. They're going to say, forget this, I don't really care enough to do it. And you guys can think of that if you've ever had a job where you work really, really, really hard and you only get, I don't know, $10 an hour, and you can think, hey, I'm working too hard for $10 an hour. This is not worth it. I'm not going to do it anymore. Same type of thing with reinforcement. Okay, last thing I wanted to mention with reinforcement is to talk about some reinforcers in the classroom. Like I mentioned before, reinforcement and feedback in general, a lot of teachers don't typically utilize it in the classroom, but it's really important for you guys to use. It increases academic skills, increases engagement, and all those things, like I said, which are key, which we need to increase in our kids with EBD. So here are some examples of positive reinforcers and negative reinforcers. So you can see with your positive reinforcers, you have praise, stickers, tokens, attention, good grades, a trophy, a prize, food, money, smile, positive feedback. All of those can be positive reinforcers. And then we have our negative reinforcers. Negative reinforcers are things such as taking away a deadline, taking away a threat, taking away criticism, stopping crying, stopping when staring. This is a huge one, actually. So basically, your positive reinforcers, there's going to be that positive reinforcement contingency, and your negative reinforcers is going to be that negative reinforcement contingency. And going back to the stopping one stare, if you guys have ever had a teacher that stares at you because they want you to start working, and then once you start working, they stop staring at you. Negative reinforcement, that stare is kind of this threat and this uncomfortable feeling that you get from that stare. So you engage in the correct behavior to remove that stare. It's aversive. So your behavior is working, and if you're not working and the teacher stares at you, you're going to start working to remove that aversive stimulus of her staring at you. So it's going to increase your behavior of working because you're removing an aversive stimulus. So those are kind of those examples of positive reinforcers and negative reinforcers. If you guys use positive reinforcers, praise is the easiest one to do. So giving praise, giving that positive feedback. And a lot of students respond really well to teacher praise and things like that. So I just have a couple little comments for you guys with regards to just positive reinforcement and things like that. So you typically want to use the least amount necessary. So if your kids respond to praise or positive feedback, then that's great. Use that. If they don't, then you might have to go to something like stickers or tokens or a prize or something like that. But you want to use that least amount necessary. So if they respond to praise, use praise. If they don't, then try your stickers, or tokens. If they don't respond to that, then you might go to, I don't know, giving that honor or that trophy. So you're making it a little bit bigger, but start off with the least amount necessary. Let's see, be specific about the behavior that you're praising and use the student's name. So this is really important. A lot of the psych literature shows that if you just say good job or great job, then that actually doesn't have the effect that you think it would. It really doesn't increase behavior like we want it to. But if you tell somebody, like, hey, you're doing a great job working on your math problems. I love how you solved that problem. Great job. I love how you moved that decimal to the right one spot when you saw this number on there, something like that. So you want to be specific about the specific behavior that you are praising and use their names so they know exactly, especially in a classroom of 20 kids, you can say, hey, little Johnny, I love how you carried your one to the next place or something like that. And so you're saying their name and specifically reinforcing the behavior that was correct or appropriate. make sure that, so anyways, if you just say good job, then it's not specific. They don't know exactly what you're reinforcing because they could be doing actually a couple of different things at one time. So username, be specific. Also, you want to make sure that you want to use you instead of I. So typically they suggest that you don't want to say something like, I love how you're working. You want to say something like, great job, you're working so hard. Wonderful, something like that. If you say I, it kind of makes it sound like, I don't know, you're requiring them to do it, or it comes back on like you, whereas you want it to come back on them being proud of their accomplishments and their behavior. You also want to make sure that it's genuine. So we talked about being genuine before with our student-teacher relationships and our genuine smiles and things like that. Kids can tell if you're genuine or not. You want to focus on students' behavior. So reinforce a specific behavior, and this goes back to this one up here. And then if you're giving feedback, you want to make sure that you fade it because you want them to engage in the behavior under natural contingencies without any type of, without a lot of positive reinforcers in there. So, or at least not a lot of artificial positive reinforcers in there, because they're not going to, when they got in the real world, each time they engage in a behavior, they're not going to be able to receive praise or tokens or attention. So you just kind of want to fade it back to where your praise and your positive feedback is just under a more natural contingency where you give it every once in a while, and maybe not after every single appropriate behavior. So which one is better? Is it better to use positive reinforcement in your classroom or negative reinforcement in your classroom? And if you guys haven't figured it out from the last slide, it is way better to use positive reinforcement than negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement, you're actually providing something, after the behavior occurs, you're providing something that the kids like. It strengthens that bond between you and the students, and they engage in the behavior, like I said, to get something that they want. Even if it's teacher praise, then they're engaging in the behavior because they get praise from you and they want that interaction, that positive interaction with you. That negative reinforcement contingency or those negative reinforcers, they're engaging in the behavior to remove something aversive, which doesn't strengthen that bond between you and the kids. It actually makes it worse. So, if they engage in the behavior, of working to stop a teacher from staring at them, then that stare was aversive and uncomfortable. And so they're engaging the behavior to stop it, not because they get something that they really want and it strengthens that relationship. And I always like to think of just kind of relationships in general. So if you guys have a partner, you asked your partner to go to the grocery store for you, you want them to go because whenever they go, it's something that it's a positive relationship. So they go and you really thank them for going and you're appreciative for them going, and they're more likely to go in the future, as opposed to them going because if they don't go, you're going to nag them. Nagging is a threat and it's aversive. So if they go to the grocery store, they avoid you nagging. And so all in all, you want your partner to do something because you like it, not because you want them to avoid being nagged at and things like that. So I always like to think of that example. So all in all, positive reinforcement, much better than negative reinforcement. All right, guys, so in this video, we talked about definition of reinforcement. We talked about positive and negative reinforcement. Remember, positive, something is given, negative, something is taken away after the behavior occurs, but both of these are reinforcement, so the behavior is going to increase in the future. When you're picking out what type of contingency it is, you're going to identify your 3 steps. So what the behavior is, after the behavior occurs, is something being given or taken away, and then does the behavior increase in the future? If it increases, it is reinforcement. If it doesn't, then it's not reinforcement. We talked about the factors that affect reinforcement. The factors that affect reinforcement. There are a couple of them. And then we talked about reinforcers in the classroom. We talked about those positive reinforcers and negative reinforcers and things like that. So that is it. Please let me know if you guys have any questions as you're going through this video, and thank you guys for watching.